Hello, beautiful visionaries. I'm your host, Lorna Liana, and today I'm really excited to bring to you Kyle Buller, the co-founder of Psychedelics Today, which is a media and education platform and podcast. Kyle earned his BA in transpersonal psychology and master's in clinical mental health counseling with an emphasis in somatic psychology. We are going to talk about the emerging field of psychedelic integration and especially the shadow side of psychedelia and why integration is important now more than ever, and how to identify whether a shadow is emerging in your life that needs to be addressed and looked at more clearly. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kyle.
Yeah, thank you, Lorna. Excited to be here.
Yeah, so it's been really a fascinating year where a lot has emerged, I would say, in the psychedelic community and especially in the plant medicine community that I would personally identify as shadow, a lot of shadow. And at the same time, what I witness as shadow and what, many other people might witness as shadow, and sizable group of people don't see it as shadow at all. And so I think it's really pertinent right now to talk about what shadow actually looks like and how to identify it. So I just kind of wanted to set that scene or the backdrop of our conversation because it can be very nuanced and complex. Really understanding what is real and what is fantasy, what is objective reality, what is subjective reality, especially when you're dealing with psychedelics. So you as a psychotherapist, I'm hoping would be able to shed some light on that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and it has been such a shadow-esque type of year, hasn't it? A lot of stuff has been emerging, and I actually put together a shadow course, shadow and psychedelia course, and it was so interesting how it started unfolding. We were thinking about wanting to do it around Halloween, and then it started to emerge right after coronavirus happened, and a lot of the shadow stuff started emerging. I was like, oh, this is perfect timing.
Yeah. So, before we dive into that very deep topic, I would love to hear, first of all, like how you even ended up becoming a psychedelic integration therapist, because that's, I think like you're one of the earlier, cohort of people coming forward. And now there's like so much more interest in psychedelic medicine and psychedelic therapies. And so it's an emerging and growing field. So what happened that, led you to this vocation?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it on the shorter end. It really kind of started when I was 16. I had a pretty profound near-death experience, got in a really bad snowboarding accident, ended up rupturing my spleen, and that really shifted my life. The doctor said if I came in 5 or 10 minutes later, I would have been dead on arrival. But during that experience, I had a pretty profound mystical experience of feeling like I was going back home, and just starting to develop a different relationship with death. And, I was on a high for a while after that. And then, reality started to sink in a couple months after that experience, and found myself in a pretty heavy existential crisis and, pretty big depression, and a lot of suicidal thinking actually as well. And I think now that I've worked through a lot of it, it's that type of thinking was tied to this feeling of wanting to go home. Because as I was dying, this voice or this light came over me telling me, you're going home, you're going back to the stars where we all come from. And so there was a part of me that really wanted to return to that experience, and actually being here in the physical world felt really challenging and really painful. So my, process with integration really starts with that experience. It was so challenging to try to bring that experience back. And, a lot of my struggles is really kind of based off of that experience, having this mystical experience coming back to the mundane. And that led me to psychedelics when I was around 19 or 20, and had a pretty profound experience with psilocybin that helped me kind of recontextualize the trauma that I went through. And it just fascinated me so much that the parallels between my near-death experience and the psilocybin experience, it just mystified me. And I just kept thinking, how could somebody take a substance and it, for me, it produced this near-death-like experience. So I went down some rabbit holes of research and came across Dr. Rick Strassman's work with DMT, the spirit molecule. And a bunch of experiences led me to this little unique college in Vermont called Burlington College, which offered a transpersonal psychology program. So I enrolled there and got to study. Most of my research papers were based off of psychedelics, and I found some breathwork teachers to work with in the lineage of Stanislav Grof. And it's always been, I guess, a huge part of my life is, what do we do with these big transformative experiences? And how do we come back to the mundane? And so had some time in the mental health field, trained in breath work for a while and still doing that work. And by the time Joe and I, the other co-founder of Psychedelics Today, we were thinking about this term integration. I was working as a volunteer with MAPS a little bit and working with their integration list. And I think that wasn't my first introduction to the word integration. I've been working on this, I guess, for a while. And we talk about it in breath work as well. How do we integrate these experiences? And Joe and I put together a course, I think it was back in 2016, 2017, a whole series on integration and self-care, because it was really under discussed at that moment. Things have really shifted in the years, and a lot of people are starting to focus on this topic of psychedelic integration. But yeah, we were definitely there, I guess, in the early years, really trying to explore this and what it means and get content around it out there for folks. So yeah, that led me to, having a therapy background, just naturally wanting to move towards this field.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. So since you work a lot with integration, psychedelic integration experiences with clients, how does the shadow emerge in that work?
Yeah, it's a great question. I might want to just say some quotes here and about what the shadow is for those that may not know what the shadow is. So here's a quote here by Carl Jung. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. And this act is the essential condition for any kind of self-knowledge. And as I mentioned, we put together a whole series on psychedelics in the shadow. And so here are some quotes of other folks kind of trying to define what the shadow is. This is by Dr. Ido Cohen. Everything that is out of the light of our consciousness, everything and anything that we are unconscious of and do not have a relationship with. Current associations of negative and darkness, which is misrepresentation. And the shadow is characterless. It's not negative or positive. It's what we are not conscious of. Here's another definition here by Laura Northrup. The shadow is parts of ourselves that have been relegated to the unconscious, the parts that cannot be tolerated consciously. These parts can range from unconscious to semi-unconscious material, parts that are fragmented off versus being more cohesive and an integrative narrative. And then Dr. Joe Tafur, our own darkness, negative intentions, self-destructive behavior, hate towards self and others, and shame. And so there's these aspects of shadow, which goes into the personal and collective shadow. So thinking about how does this show up personally for people in psychedelic experiences? Well, it might be these really dark aspects of yourself in ceremony while taking a psychedelic. Maybe you're confronting past traumas that you've kind of just tucked away and put. And so now all of a sudden this darkness is right in front of you and you're facing it and don't really know how to deal with it. I'm thinking back to some of my own experiences, being confronted, I guess, with this shadow of death and kind of the way I was thinking about these experiences. And I think in one of my darkest moments, it was really kind of around a lot of that suicidal thinking, and being afraid of it and being like, oh my God, I can't believe I went there as a teenager after this experience. But then realizing it, like it's there, confronting it and realizing, oh, that I was yearning for another experience. I was secretly trying to seek that experience of me dying again, to go back to this quote unquote home feeling. And then we could get into some of the collective aspects of the shadow, and that shows up pretty often. I think it's showing up now very often.
But before we dive into
it.
that, which is a fascinating topic in and of itself, I have some questions about one's own personal shadow, right?
Yeah.
So is it possible to heal your shadow completely, or is it something that you just learn to manage? So, for example, like you had this traumatic near-death experience, and then you found yourself entertaining, thoughts of suicidal ideation because you longed to go back to that feeling of home. Now, that seems to me like a circumstantial
Totally.
experience, right? Not like, something that kind of came from long-term trauma, that kind of you endured for a long time that allowed you or led to you having, a belief in yourself that you didn't deserve to live, for example. So, when you worked with the mushrooms and was able to, reframe that whole experience, were you then able to heal that shadow so that it doesn't come back? It doesn't like actually become part of your day-to-day consciousness again?
Yeah, and I always come back to this question, like, what is healing? And for me, do I ever really heal any of these aspects? And when I think about this question, I think about, how has my relationship changed to this part of myself? And I think that is, for me, the key to it is not necessarily saying I need to get rid of this thing, I need to heal it, and I need to be done with it. It's always going to be there to some degree, in my opinion. But how do we shift the relationship to that aspect? So, you said this was a very circumstantial thing, and I'm thinking about a lot of defense mechanisms that come up, early childhood trauma, things that you experience, and we start to develop these defense mechanisms, these protector parts that are trying to protect us and keep us alive and safe. And that could be shadow aspects, right? Like these parts of ourselves that are unconscious, but to face that can be really scary and really challenging. So how do we start to try to develop a relationship and shift the relationship there to say, this isn't a bad thing and this isn't a good thing, kind of going back to this sense that it's neutral. These are here, right? So just thinking about a defense mechanism in the shadow of that, saying like, there is a legitimate reason why you needed to act that way. And there's a legitimate reason why that shadow aspect is there for your survival at times, right? So how can we shift it and say, that's a bad thing, I want to completely get rid of and heal it and move on, versus how do we change the relationship with it and start to integrate it and be like, oh, that part of me actually needed to do that, or I need to give that part maybe a little bit more attention. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. It does make sense a lot. Yeah. I see that, when a person, when you figuratively speaking, recognize that there is something that has been in the shadows that needs to be healed, that is a first step that will then allow you to seek the solution, or, give it more attention, or, orient, healing practices and support around it. But another thing that I noticed too is that it can be very difficult for any of us to see our shadow. I mean, that's why it's called the shadow. It just follows us everywhere. It's in our blind spot. We just don't know it's there, but it's like completely obvious to everybody else. And it may even be negatively impacting your ability to get what you want in life. And so, I think this process of inquiry over, whether there is a shadow aspect that's coming out that needs to be healed or resolved, like how, what do you do if you don't even have the capacity to see it because it's in your blind spot?
Well, I think that's where, finding somebody to work with, whether that's a therapist or a coach, that can help kind of mirror that back to you and explore that. But also just being curious about your own process, just taking a step back and being like, what parts of myself like seem to get in the way, and started just bringing some conscious awareness on how you act on a day to day, and see maybe where these different shadow aspects start to show up, and just to develop a sense of curiosity. Because I think sometimes when that shows up, yes, it is unconscious, but I think there's a part that wants to push it away. That's not part of me. That's not who I am, right? Instead of saying like, maybe that is there, and okay, well, what's going on there? Oh, maybe that's like my younger self starting to act out. That's my younger self that I've kind of pushed away and didn't want to give any attention to. So how do we start to just develop a little bit more curiosity around your own process here, and just start to develop more awareness around it?
Yeah, I think having somebody that can reflect back is really important as well.
Super important, yeah.
Because, I think like as human beings, we all have patterns, and it's possible to begin to see if something is a pattern because you find yourself in these repeat situations and repeat dynamics and repeat dramas with other people that kind of look the same. And so if they're looking the same, then the common denominator in the picture is you. And so that might be a starting point to notice, okay, there's a shadow aspect of myself that I need to resolve or heal if I want this dynamic to change with other people.
Well, and that's like a really interesting thing to think about too, in different relationships, whether that's like romantic or friendships, and thinking that like something triggered you. Is it that person's fault, or is it this different part inside of you that's getting, activated by a particular pattern? And, maybe that's a practice too. Instead of like pointing blame at somebody, how do you bring that inside and be like, what part of myself is getting triggered here? Right? Or somebody's saying like, oh, you did this thing wrong. It's like, how can we maybe look at that? Even if it's not true in your reality, but just having enough curiosity to be like, what is going on there? Maybe this is a pattern that I continue to do over and over again, and I'm not aware of it, and this person is telling me, but I don't want to hear it because it's not true. So having, I guess, even enough humility to be like, maybe this is what I do. I don't know, just to be curious about it.
Okay, so now in this realm of psychedelics, right? So, they can be really powerful tools to help us see those aspects of ourselves that are hidden, so that we can work on healing those aspects in a more intentional and even accelerated way. Because I think often, with more traditional therapy, the process can be slower. Whereas like with the psychedelics, it's just kind of like, what? It's like they completely amplified and in your face. And it's like, oh my God, it's so, just, so much bigger. So then this starts to lead to what we're seeing in the collective, right? So there's a shadow that is kind of like, that looks like grandiosity, or it looks like, some type of delusion, hyper, toxic positivity, so to speak. I think we're witnessing a lot of this right now in the psychedelic community and in the plant medicine community, which are communities of people that are historically just counterculture. They're rebellious. They're not mainstream. They're kind of anti-authoritarian. And so then what's being triggered is, are these control mechanisms around the pandemic. And so with the just massive amounts of disinformation and misinformation that's going around, all this overwhelm of information is starting to fuel a lot of delusional thinking, so to speak. And it almost feels like, and I don't know, like, because I'm in the psychedelic community, so this is my world, right? So it almost seems like psychedelic people are more susceptible to the bullshit, that's coming out on the internet and YouTube, and, like, oh my God, like, how do they believe that? And at the same time, there has been this hope, I would say, that psychedelics would actually awaken us, and that all, traumas and shadows and, issues could be healed with psychedelics. And now that's really coming into the spotlight as to perhaps that's not possible. So how do you address the shadow side of psychedelia as it pertains or relates to collective behaviors?
It's a big question. One thing that I come back to is Stanislav Grof's kind of definition of psychedelic. And he said that, these are non-specific amplifiers or mental or psychic processes. So, if that way of thinking is already in there, you're saying rebellious, anti-authority and whatnot, can get amplified, right? And I think people that seek out these types of experiences, maybe we are a little bit more susceptible. I think Terence McKenna said psychedelics seem to promote funny ideas. When these experiences get amplified, I think we are in this more suggestible state to believe in these very unique alternative narratives that are floating out there, right? You have an experience with ayahuasca and, you start to communicate with spirits. Well, now this spiritual narrative starts to become real when that wasn't a thing that you really believed in. Or, you smoke DMT and get to experience the self-transforming machine elves. And now, maybe alien theories start to become real because you had an experience that validated maybe this alternative narrative. And I think for those of us that are in the community, and I think there's a little bit of vulnerability here because we are seekers, right? We're looking for maybe something else because we realize current systems maybe aren't working, and we are kind of seeking at times these alternative narratives and storylines. I think the main thing is that we really have to use a lot of discernment. How do we know what's true? And that is a really tricky thing, I think, is how do you know that, what the DMT entities are telling you is true? And we could take that and run with it, and maybe this is where we start to see some of these shadow aspects of you kind of mentioned just toxic positivity, right? Like I saw this, I had this very enlightening experience. This is the shadow aspect, right? So I'm beyond everybody else. I'm resonating at a frequency higher than everybody else. So I'm, untouchable. Everybody else, is below me because they haven't gotten to my level and my realm. And how do you pull back? And, I'll speak from my own experience. I've been there, I've been there multiple times of being on the brink of dying and having this mystical experience and telling myself I know what's on the other side. And then being humbled through a lot of other experiences, be I actually have no idea what the hell is going on. And I don't know what's out on the other side. But to really come back to our humanness, right? Coming back to this reality. And I think that's part of the integration process. It's even though we had these spiritual experiences that might make us feel superior, we're all human. We're all on this earth, right? And we're all trying our best. And does that put you ahead of, the people that are really trying, even though they might be asleep still, right? And I think about some of those spiritual traditions, maybe like the Bodhisattva, right? Coming back and helping those people awaken, right? Do we need to stand on the outskirts and push everybody else away because we say we found enlightenment and I know what's true? Or do you come back and really embody that and say, now I'm here to serve and now I'm here to help people? And I think that's a challenge, right? When we've been exposed to the numinous at times, because then it starts to become a little grandiose. And I've been there, definitely.
Yeah, but then you have the psychedelic messiah syndrome too, where the person's, trying to, help everyone and help them awaken. And then, but I don't know, they're just kind of turning into a fire hose of bullshit,
that too.
conspiracy ideas that have no evidence, but they think that they're actually being helpful. So what I've witnessed too is it's interesting because I tend to orient towards being more science driven, and I like data and big data studies and peer research, peer reviewed research papers, and things that and kind of like a consensus, like evidence gathering, like, oh yeah, like scientists in Germany and scientists in the United States, and and then just kind of like collectively sharing information to understand what phenomena is. Like, this is kind of like how my mind works in trying to understand what's going on in the world. And what I find really interesting are, there's a very significant population of plant medicine facilitators, psychedelic facilitators, and coaches and therapists that have very different beliefs about whether masks are actually dangerous for you. Like, you will actually compromise your immune system if you wear a mask, and it's all part of the control mechanism to to limit your freedoms and enslave you. And so, to me, and my worldview, that looks like a shadow side of psychedelia in a different way. You have people who are in these positions of administering psychedelics, or serving or being in service to people that are in suggestible states of mind, or are vulnerable because they are working with psychedelics and now receiving therapy services or coaching services. How do you address that potential shadow side? Like, a big question that's come up for me this past year is, if a person is going to another shaman, psychedelic facilitator, ceremony leader, therapist, and trying to heal something in themselves that could look like trauma, or suicidal ideation, or abuse, or PTSD, and the person who's assisting them has very alternative views that might be considered to be conspiratorial, or not founded in consensus reality. Does that matter?
Does it matter from the facilitator's aspect of like carrying that?
Well, I mean, does it matter at all? Like, the person's coming to a facilitator to heal some aspect of their past, and that facilitator has very alternative beliefs that they might share with their client, and potentially influence that client in a certain direction. Is that harmful? Or is it inconsequential because they're there to heal something else that has nothing to do with aliens, or whatever, agenda, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question to ask. And it has me thinking about a paper that was just released by Dr. Matthew Johnson from Johns Hopkins. And this is coming from the psychedelic research and therapeutic aspect in the terms of therapy, and saying that should psychedelic therapists in general have a statue of the Buddha? Should we be bringing our own spiritual beliefs into the therapy room? And thinking about from that therapeutic point of view, no, I'm trying to leave some of those aspects out, right? Because it's really about the client. And so I'm just thinking, I guess there's these different use contexts and different containers. If you're showing up to a place that isn't practicing from that therapeutic model, where, maybe there's not a lot of self-disclosing, and, we're really trying to remain a little bit neutral and help the client find their own healing. Like, even in the breathwork model, we're very non-directive. We're not trying to put our experiences on your experience. We're not trying to define your experience. We don't know what your experience is like. And so, that's just the framework that we come from. I think, that's my bias. I think that is really important, to have the client or the participant show up and figure out how they want to do their own healing work. I've always been a little skeptical of people that have been doing healing work. And I've been in these situations where I projected, I guess, their sense of authority onto them, and really thought that they had all the answers, that like I could really rely on them. And then I'm in that high suggestibility state and going, oh, whatever they tell me is going to be true. And then like I should listen to that, versus kind of being my own sense of authority and have that agency over my own healing. And that's the one thing I really liked about stumbling across breathwork. It was was like all me trying to do the work, making the meaning out of it, not having somebody else stand over me and tell me this is what your experience is, and this is the narrative you should believe in. There's spirits around you influencing your, you have these hungry ghosts attached to you, or this or that, or your 5D reality is coming in, and whatnot.
Well, so maybe,
and again, I'm sure it's really helpful for those people that want that. It felt helpful for me when I was in that seeking mode to want to find people to tell me what my experience was. But then it got to a point of going like, well, whose experience is this? Sounds like I'm just searching for everybody else's experience besides my own. But again, where's the harm come, right? If you have everybody telling you not to believe in science, and now, the virus is spreading, this and that, what type of community harm does that do long term? And so that's something to consider as well. Do these ideas or beliefs cause some sort of community harm down the line?
Yeah, I don't think there's very many easy answers at all to, to these questions. But I think you brought up a really great point that I resonate with, which is agency, right? So, if a person is seeking healing support from a psychedelic facilitator or a therapist, and they would feel safe with somebody who firmly believes that there's an alien agenda, or firmly believes that, Q is real, and, it's just a matter of time before like the big event happens that, everyone's going to be liberated or something, then perhaps, that's what they need. And that they have that agency, that's where they're going to feel the most safe. So that's one way of looking at it. And then of course, on the bigger, collective side, depending on, what's actually real, there's the other question, like, is it beneficial for society as a whole?
And I think what we've been seeing, I would say probably no. I mean, it's caused a lot of like chaos at this moment, right? Mm-hmm. It's really kind of, has it been beneficial? I'm not too sure. But again, I guess it comes back to some of this, like, I think where we're at culturally is that it seems that we have this huge distrust in government, in religious institutions, and in science. And I think that's somewhat is what is driving a lot of this, right? It's like we've kind of lacked. It's like we distrust all these institutions around us. So anything that we're getting fed by the quote unquote mainstream, I think it's easy to like rebel against that and not want to believe it when has been a lot of systemic abuse happening throughout the decades and centuries. And so I think, maybe within us, maybe there's just this distrust, thinking like epigenetics and whatnot, things just getting passed down. And maybe there is just this general sense of like, we don't trust these institutions because there's been, this history of abuse. And I think, we're at this like really interesting crossroads, especially with the development of the internet and information, the way that it's just being circulated. It's like, how do we redevelop trust in certain institutions? But also, how do we discern information that's coming in? And I think that's probably the most important thing, is how do we discern information? There's so much of it now. I mean, before it was like, you get little bits and pieces. Now it's at your fingertips 24/7, all sorts of different narratives, and it just doesn't stop.
Yeah, that's a very good question. One of the nihilistic responses that I've seen to this, just kind of like general sense of distrust with institutions and authorities, which is well-founded. We've got a history of, institutional abuses, and, their manipulation has and, will continue to exist at the highest levels. And at the same time, because those things are true, and because we have so much information to sift through, I notice a response that basically is almost like a giving up. It's like, well, it's impossible to know anything. How can we know? It's impossible to know anything. And I really want to encourage people to not go down that route, because, I feel like we need to somehow, and perhaps this might be a good role or, effort for folks that are in these, healing professions to take on, which is trying to give people back their sense of power and agency and ability to discern. Like, how do you process information that's coming at you in life in general to make decisions that are ultimately wholesome and healthy for you, and then the people around you, and then society as a whole? So that's what's coming to me. But yeah, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on how we might be able to heal the shadow side of psychedelia at a collective level?
Well, I get, yeah, and I guess there's all these certain issues, right? Yeah, I mean, you have the personal shadow aspects, and we kind of went into that, maybe Messiah complex, some of the grandiose things that appear, a lot of spiritual bypassing that happens, on that personal level. And then some of the other things that we've explored is like the shadow aspect of like capital coming in, and capitalism, and pharma taking over, and IP, and this and that, and that's a shadow aspect too, right? And so there's a lot of different kind of things that are unfolding right now. So it is a big question to really answer. But I think as long as we start on the personal, I always come back to something. My teacher always quoted this from Bucky Fuller. I never really found the quote, but he told me recently he heard it at a lecture, so maybe that's why I can't find the quote. But somebody asked, like, what is our job here on the universe? And Bucky Fuller responded, to make small local adjustments. And so how can we really sit with our own personal shadow at times to do that work, confront it, and then maybe that starts to ripple out on the collective level, and how we start to make decisions going forward on those bigger scales. So I really think, how do we do our own work, confront our own shadow, and then maybe we can do that. We can face some of these bigger collective issues. So for example, one thing that we explored in this was even kind of like the shadow side of ketamine. You see a lot of different kind of models appearing. You have the quick kind of IV clinics, and not doing any sort of therapy or integration work, just kind of hooking people up, making lots of money possibly with that. And I think if there is the education out there on these different models, it's like, to some degree, those are great for pain management and different use cases. But if they're advertising a psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, or they're providing, this type of service, and they're not getting it. I mean, this is stuff I hear all the time of people saying like, oh, I went to this like clinic and they provided no integration, no preparation, no therapy, but they're advertising like that. And, I think if we're able to really educate ourselves and maybe do some of that work, we could ask ourselves, well, why am I seeking this type of treatment? And do I want to put my energy towards a model that I don't believe in, even though that's available, and maybe that's the only option for people? But just thinking about like, how do we combat some of these other issues that are starting to form here?
Yeah.
I don't know, it's big. There's so many nuances and so many different things unfolding.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's important to just keep having these conversations, keep asking questions, keep, being in a state of, curiosity and inquiry as well. Again, there are no black and white, clear-cut answers to any of this, but I think it's going to be just a process of unfolding because a lot of these things are very new. So we don't necessarily know what the shadow sides are going to be until after a thing rolls out. And then it's like, oh, whoa, like, capitalization and medicalization of psychedelics, and what are we going to do about it? So, but I think like the healthy dialogue is always good, and of course, the work that you do with Psychedelics Today and educating the public and raising awareness about psychedelics and harm reduction and ethics. These are all really important conversations to keep having. So thank you so much for your time today. We're at the end of our session. Wanted to ask you what your free gift is for the audience.
Yeah, thank you. So we're giving away a free copy of our trip and integration workbook. I think it's a little under 200 pages. They're two separate workbooks combined into one PDF. So that's our gift to you if you're taking a journey. Hopefully, give you a little bit of harm reduction tips and techniques, and also a nice way to work with the experience afterwards. A lot of journal prompts, and again, bringing awareness to your experience, bringing intention to your experience, and hopefully to minimize any risks and get the benefit out of it.
Love it. Thank you so much. We're going to put that link right below this video. And how can the audience best stay in touch with you, Kyle?
You can check us out at psychedelicstoday.com. And if you want to subscribe to our podcast, we put out 2 episodes a week. And you can find that on any podcast app, Apple, Google, Stitcher, wherever you listen to, or Spotify. So yeah, psychedelicstoday.com and Psychedelics Today on your podcast apps.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts about this really fascinating emerging world of psychedelics. And I look forward to connecting with you soon. Bye for now.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.